Somewhere in America, in 1965, a recording session ended. The record was pressed. A few hundred copies went out. Nobody bought it. The label moved on. And that should have been the end of the story. But then a British DJ flew to the States with an empty suitcase and a mission, dug through the back rooms of soul record stores, and brought something home that nobody in America wanted. The working-class kids of Northern England heard it at 2 in the morning on a wooden dance floor, and they went absolutely wild. This is their story. Number 12. Yvonne Baker, You Didn't Say a Word, 1967. Yvonne Baker started her career as a member of the Sensations, a Philadelphia doo-wop group that scored a pair of hits in the late 1950s and early 1960s. By the mid-1960s, she had gone solo, recording for Parkway Records, the subsidiary of Philadelphia's Cameo Parkway label, one of the most important independents of the pre-Motown era. Her 1967 single put To Prove My Love Is True on the A-side and something called You Didn't Say a Word on the flip. In America, the record went nowhere. In Britain, it eventually became something close to a miracle. You Didn't Say a Word is built on a piano hook and a rhythm section that locks in with the kind of four-on-the-floor drive that Northern soul dancers craved. Fast enough to test your footwork, soulful enough to break your heart. Baker's voice pulls back just before the hook, then releases with full intensity. The effect on Wigan Casino's dance floor was physical. The record ranked number 3 in the Northern Soul Top 500. A poll of scene veterans compiled in 2000 by Wigan Casino DJ Kev Roberts, ranking the most beloved records in the entire history of the Northern Soul movement. Number 3, out of 500, a Philadelphia B-side from 1967. There is a story from inside Wigan Casino that perfectly captures why this record matters. Someone approached the stage one night and requested the James Bond theme. DJ Russ Winstanley knew exactly what they meant. Not Shirley Bassey, not John Barry. He reached into his crate and pulled out Yvonne Baker. The bass line of You Didn't Say a Word apparently bore just enough resemblance to the Bond theme's opening that the request had become scene shorthand. Winstanley dropped the needle. The floor erupted. That's Northern Soul. That's Yvonne Baker. Number 11, Al Wilson, The Snake, 1968.
Welcome to my special guest today, Mr. Al Wilson.
Most people know Al Wilson for Show and Tell, the 1974 #1 hit, covered in a previous video. But The Snake, recorded 4 years earlier on Soul City Records, led a completely separate life on the other side of the Atlantic that most American listeners never knew about.
Fully evident on songs like Show and Tell, Touch and Go, and The Snake. Each performance
The Snake is built on a spoken word fable. A woman takes in a half-frozen snake, nurses it back to health, and the snake bites her. As she lies dying, she asks why. The snake's answer, "You knew I was a snake when you picked me up." Wilson delivers it with a combination of hypnotic cool and raw gospel soul that made the record something impossible to ignore. It hit number 27 on the Billboard Hot 100 in America in 1968. But at Wigan Casino, The Snake took on an entirely different life. The Wigan Casino Midnight Ritual, one of the most documented and beloved traditions in the entire Northern Soul scene, worked like this. Every Saturday night, as the clock hit 3 in the morning, a hushed anticipation would sweep across the floor. The lights would dim. DJ Russ Winstanley would drop the needle on the snake every single time. 8 years of Saturday nights. 3 o'clock, The Snake. Dancers had heard it hundreds of times. It didn't matter. The opening bars still triggered the same rush, the same communal electricity of thousands of people recognizing simultaneously that the midpoint of the night had arrived and the best hours were still ahead. Al Wilson had recorded The Snake for an American audience, thinking about everyday betrayal and foolish trust. Wigan Casino turned it into a ceremony, into the specific sound of 3 in the morning in Lancashire for the better part of a decade. Every surviving Wigan veteran carries that 3 o'clock moment somewhere in their body. Some music gets inside you differently depending on where you were when you first heard it. For the Northern Soul faithful, The Snake is the sound of being exactly where you were supposed to be. Number 10, The Velvelettes. These Things Will Keep Me Loving You, 1966. The Velvelettes came from Kalamazoo and Battle Creek, Michigan. Young women who came up through the Motown system in the mid-1960s, several of them still studying at Western Michigan University when they were signed. They had a genuine Motown hit in 1964 with Needle in a Haystack, number 45 on the Hot 100, Real Commercial Promise. Then, like so many Motown acts who weren't the Supremes or the Temptations, they were quietly sidelined. In 1966, the group recorded These Things Will Keep Me Loving You, released by Motown on the VIP subsidiary label. It had everything the Motown formula required: the hand claps, the driving rhythm section, the layered harmonies, the horn punches on the offbeat. But it was treated as a B-side, received no significant promotion, and disappeared. The VIP label was routinely where Motown put material it didn't have time to develop properly, which made it a specific hunting ground for Northern Soul collectors, for British DJs digging through American record store back rooms in the early 1970s. VIP pressings were treasure, records with full Motown production quality that had slipped through the cracks of Motown's overwhelming promotional machine. These Things Will Keep Me Loving You had everything a Northern Soul floor needed: the tempo, the groove, the emotional temperature. It became a casino floor filler, beloved by dancers who had no idea the group that recorded it had been sidelined by their own label. The Velvelettes eventually reformed and performed on the Northern Soul circuit in Britain, receiving the kind of sustained appreciation that Motown's own promotional machine had never given them. Sometimes you have to travel 5,000 miles to find the audience that was always yours.
Just to tell these stories right. If you've made it this far into the video, you're clearly part of the community, so please hit subscribe. It costs nothing and helps us immensely. Now, for those already subscribed, very few of you have made the jump to our membership, and that's a hard pill to swallow because you're the ones who know our value best. If this channel has moved you or inspired you, consider joining. It's the price of one coffee, but it's the literal fuel for this channel. Let's keep this alive together. Back to the story.
Number 9, The Flirtations. Nothing But a Heartache, 1969. The Flirtations have one of the most unusual origin stories in soul music history. 4 women, Ernestine Pierce, her sister Shirley, and 2 other singers originally from South Carolina, relocated to the United Kingdom in the mid-1960s. They were signed to a British label, Deram Records, and recorded Nothing But a Heartache in London in 1968, with the song released in early 1969. Here is what makes the record exceptional. Nothing But a Heartache is the rarest thing in Northern Soul, an R&B record made specifically in the UK by American singers who had moved to Britain. that found its way back into the Northern Soul scene as though it were a lost American gem. The production, big strings, punching horns, the voices stacking in total precision. Convinced many listeners it was an American record. It had the drive, the urgency, the emotional temperature that the scene demanded. It reached number 34 on the UK singles chart in 1969. On the Northern Soul circuit, it took on a second life as one of the most reliable dance floor records of the entire era. The tempo sits at the exact sweet spot for the athletic Northern Soul dancing style. The backspins, the drops, the footwork patterns that Wigan regulars had been developing for years. And the song's emotional arc, pure romantic devastation delivered with complete vocal control, hit exactly the nerve the scene was built to service. The flirtation story is a reminder that Northern Soul was not purely about obscure American records nobody had heard. It was about finding records that delivered a specific physical and emotional experience on the dance floor. And sometimes those records were made in London by South Carolina women who had taken a very unusual route to becoming Northern Soul legends. Number 8. Jimmy Radcliffe, Long After Tonight Is All Over, 1964. Jimmy Radcliffe, born in Harlem in 1936, sang gospel as a child, served in the Air Force, performed with a vocal group on the Armed Forces Network in Germany, returned to New York, and eventually caught the ear of Aaron Schroeder, the songwriter who had written It's Now or Never for Elvis Presley, who had recently founded Musicor Records. In 1964, producer Burt Burns, one of the most important and underrated figures in 1960s American soul, dusted off a Burt Bacharach and Hal David instrumental track and had Radcliffe add new vocals. The song was Long After Tonight Is All Over, originally written as a demo intended for Gene Pitney. Pitney never recorded it. Radcliffe did. Musicor released it. The song reached number 40 in the UK in early 1965, earning Radcliffe a promotional tour of Britain. He appeared on Ready Steady Go, the defining British pop TV show of the era, on an episode that also featured the Rolling Stones and the Righteous Brothers. That UK chart run was the first act. The second act came years later, when Northern Soul DJs discovered that the arrangement, the strings swelling at precisely the right moment, Radcliffe's voice carrying a specific weight of emotional exhaustion, made it the ideal record for the end of an all-night session. Win Stanley chose it as the second of the 3 closing records at Wigan Casino, a song written as a demo for Gene Pitney, sung by a Harlem singer who served in the Air Force, that charted alongside the Rolling Stones in 1965, and then became the second-to-last record played at the world's greatest soul all-nighter for 8 consecutive years. That's a journey. Number 7. Tobi Legend, Toby Lark, Time Will Pass You By, 1968. Here is a story about a record that its own singer didn't know existed, at least not in the form the world came to know it. Bessie Grace Gupton, born in Alabama in 1941, gospel family, moved to Detroit in the 1960s. In 1968, she went into a Detroit recording studio and recorded a song called Time Will Pass You By. She recorded it believing she was cutting a demo, a work tape, not a finished record. The song was released without her full knowledge or approval on Mala Records under the name Tobi Legend, not her stage name, a name essentially assigned to her for the release. In America, it failed to chart, almost completely invisible, and then the Northern Soul scene found it. The opening bars, a piano figure building slowly before the rhythm section locks in, and then Bessie Gupton's gospel-rooted voice arriving with total authority, hit Wigan Casino's dance floor with an impact that nobody has ever been able to fully describe in words without sounding slightly unhinged. It became the first of the 3 closing records, first of the 3 before 8, played 8 years of Saturday mornings as the first signal that the night was ending. A woman who recorded a song she believed was a demo, didn't know it had been released under a name she hadn't chosen, had no idea it had crossed the Atlantic. And became the opening act of the most beloved musical ritual in British subculture history. Bessie Gupton, Tobi Legend, has since performed in the UK for the people who made her accidental record an institution. She has been gracious and moved by what this community did with a song she almost never knew had been released. Number 6. Dean Parrish, I'm on My Way, 1967. Dean Parrish, real name Phil Anastasi, Queens, New York, 1941. Recorded for a string of small independent labels throughout the mid-1960s without a commercial breakthrough. His 1967 single on Lorry Records' UNI subsidiary featured Tell Her on the A side and I'm on My Way on the B side. In America, neither track made any significant impression. In Britain, I'm on My Way became something no record was ever designed to be, the last song of the night. Every night, every all-nighter at Wigan Casino ended the same way. DJ Russ Winstanley would play 3 records before the doors opened at 8 in the morning. The 3 before 8. First came Tobi Legend, then Jimmy Radcliffe, and finally, always finally, Dean Parrish's I'm on My Way. 3 songs chosen specifically to build a shared feeling of melancholy mixed with euphoria. I'm on my way. The bittersweet experience of a perfect night coming to its end. This ritual ran for 8 years, but on December 6, 1981, the final night Wigan Casino ever opened, after Wigan Council decided to close the venue, the 3 before 8 was played 3 times consecutively, 3 times back to back, because the crowd refused to let it end. Big city woman gonna flick this time. When I'm on My Way played for the absolute last time, and the lights came up, and the doors opened onto a Sunday morning in Lancashire, grown men and women who had been dancing since 2 in the morning stood on that floor and wept. Dean Parrish was eventually tracked down by Northern Soul journalists and brought to England to perform for the people who had made his forgotten B-side an institution. He performed for crowds who could recite every word of a song that had been completely unknown in his own country. Dean Parrish is still active on the Northern Soul circuit today. He knows what his record means, and it means everything. I'm on my way. Number 5. R. Dean Taylor, There's a Ghost in My House, 1967. R. Dean Taylor is one of the very few white artists in Motown's history, a Canadian songwriter signed to Barry Gordy's label as much for his writing as for his performing. He co-wrote hits for the Four Tops, The Temptations, and Diana Ross and the Supremes, working alongside the legendary Holland Dozier Holland team. In 1966, Taylor co-wrote There's a Ghost in My House with Holland Dozier Holland, a song Motown lore says began as a demo for the Four Tops before Taylor claimed it for himself. It was released on the VIP subsidiary label in April 1967. Motown did virtually nothing to promote it. It didn't chart, headed for permanent obscurity. Then DJ Ian Levine, one of the most influential figures in Northern Soul history, known for flying to the United States with empty boxes and coming back with records nobody in Britain had heard, discovered the VIP pressing on a US trip. He introduced it at Blackpool Mecca. It spread to Wigan Casino, and the working-class dancers of Northern England turned it into an anthem. What happened next is one of the most extraordinary examples of a subculture's power over the mainstream music industry. Motown, Gordy's legendary label, noticed that a 7-year-old record it had ignored was now famous in British clubs. Motown reissued it on EMI's Tamla Motown label in 1974. There's a Ghost in My House hit number 3 on the UK singles chart. A song that flopped in 1967 reached the top 3 in 1974 because Northern England dancers refused to let it die. The Fall covered it in 1987. The Damned covered it in 2025. 5 decades of life for a record Motown almost threw away. Number 4, Tobi Gray, Out on the Floor, 1966. We've covered Tobi Gray and Drift Away in a previous video, but Drift Away is not Tobi Gray's most important record, not in Britain, not to the people who matter most in this story. Out on the Floor was released on Charger Records in the United States in 1966 and went essentially nowhere. In the year 2000, 34 years after its American release, Wigan Casino DJ Kev Roberts compiled the Northern Soul Top 500, a survey of scene veterans and collectors ranking the most beloved records in the entire canon. Out on the Floor ranked in the top 10 of 500 records spanning an entire decade of American soul music. The song is about dancing, not metaphorically, literally about dancing, about being on a dance floor, moving, losing yourself, for a subculture built entirely around that specific physical and emotional experience. The lyrical content was almost absurdly perfect. The Northern Soul faithful weren't dancing to abstractions. They were dancing to this specific record at 2 in the morning on a wooden floor, while the song told them exactly what they were doing and why it mattered. It charted in the UK in 1975, 9 years after its American release. When Northern Soul's popularity was at its peak, the scene's appetite for its favorite records was large enough to drive real commercial sales. The record entered the charts. A Charger Records release from 1966 hit the British charts in 1975. That is what this subculture could do. It has been called the song that defines Northern Soul, not a song that defines it, the song. Of all 500 records in the canon, that is what a largely unknown American 45 became in the hands of the right audience. Number 3, Gloria Jones, Tainted Love, 1964. Gloria Jones, born in Cincinnati in 1945, raised in Los Angeles from age 7, grew up singing gospel, became a background vocalist at Motown's West Coast operations in the early 1960s, wrote hits including If I Were Your Woman for Gladys Knight and the Pips. Producer Ed Cobb, who had first offered the song to a group called the Standells, who turned it down, brought Jones into the studio in 1964 to record a song he had written called Tainted Love. The backing track features Glenn Campbell on lead guitar, before Campbell had his own major fame. The production is pure Motown influence, fast tempo, punching horns, electric rhythm guitar, a hook that works immediately. Ed Cobb put Tainted Love on the B-side of Jones's 1965 single, My Bad Boy's Comin' Home. Both sides were commercial flops in America. The record sat in bins and was forgotten. In 1973, DJ Richard Serling flew to the United States on one of the Northern Soul scene's regular record-buying trips. He found a copy of Gloria Jones's 1965 single. He listened to the B-side. He brought it back to England, introduced it at Vava's Soul Club in Bolton, then brought it to Wigan Casino, where it became one of the venue's most celebrated records. Gloria Jones came to Wigan in 1973 to perform the song live. The same year, Serling had discovered it. She stood on that stage and watched British working-class kids who knew every word of a song she had recorded a decade ago and almost completely forgotten. She told journalists the crowd had gone absolutely crazy, that it was their national anthem. Mark Almond of Soft Cell heard Tainted Love through the Northern Soul scene. He recorded his synth-pop version in 1981. It became the UK's best-selling single of that year. Over 100 artists have covered it since. All of it traces back to a B-side that flopped in America, one DJ with an empty suitcase, and a wooden dance floor in Wigan. Number 2. Chuck Wood, 7 Days Too Long, 1967. Chuck Wood is one of the Northern Soul scene's most celebrated mysteries. His 1967 single, 7 Days Too Long, was released on the Sulin label, a tiny independent that pressed a few hundred copies and left almost no paper trail. Wood himself is a figure about whom relatively little biographical information has been confirmed. His real identity and background remain matters of some debate among collectors and researchers. What is not in debate is what his record did on the dance floor. 7 Days Too Long is a masterpiece of compressed soul energy. In under 3 minutes, it builds from a sparse opening, just bass, rhythm, and a voice, through a full horn arrangement and a chorus that has the urgency of something that has been waiting to be said for too long. The tempo is perfectly calibrated for the Northern Soul dancing style. The vocal delivery hits the zone between controlled precision and raw release that makes a record work in a room full of people who have been dancing for 4 hours and aren't done yet. On the Northern Soul scene, 7 Days Too Long became a legitimate floor classic, a record that DJs reached for when a room needed to be turned up, when the energy needed to shift up a level, when the night needed a signal that something was happening that had never happened before. The combination of its scarcity and original Sulin pressing is extraordinarily rare, and its undeniable dance floor power gave it a specific mystique that the more easily available records never quite matched. In a scene built on the idea that the rarer the record, the more sacred it becomes, 7 Days Too Long occupied a particular place of reverence, not because it was the most expensive record in the canon, or because a major label eventually noticed and reissued it. But because when the needle hit that groove in a dark room at 3 in the morning in Lancashire, something happened that couldn't be explained, only experienced. Number 1. Frank Wilson, Do I Love You? Indeed I Do, 1965. This is the rarest, most expensive, most obsessively coveted record in the entire history of Northern Soul, and the story of why it exists at all is almost too strange to be believed. Frank Wilson was a songwriter and producer who joined Motown in 1965. He wrote for Stevie Wonder, The Temptations, Marvin Gaye, Diana Ross, and The Supremes. In late 1965, he recorded Do I Love You? Indeed I Do, for release on Motown's Soul subsidiary label. The single was scheduled for December 23, 1965, and then Frank Wilson decided he'd rather be a producer than a performer. Gordy, according to Wilson's own account, essentially gave him a choice, producer or artist. Wilson chose producer. The single was shelved. Approximately 250 demo copies had been pressed. Motown destroyed them, all of them, except for somewhere between 2 and 5 copies that had already left the building before the destruction order was carried out. One of those surviving copies was borrowed by a Northern Soul DJ named Simon Susan, who made a bootleg, sped it up slightly and released it under the fake name Eddie Foster, standard practice among competitive DJs who wanted to maintain their edge on a discovery. The bootleg spread through the scene. The dance floor response was extraordinary. Eventually, the original pressing was identified, and the hunt for an authentic copy became one of the defining obsessions of Northern Soul collecting. In April 2009, one original pressing of Do I Love You, Indeed I Do, sold at auction for £25,742, the most expensive soul single ever sold, a record Motown had ordered destroyed. Frank Wilson knew about the record's Northern Soul status. He reportedly owned one of the surviving copies and said he was moved and astonished by what had happened to a song he'd recorded once and walked away from. He died in 2012 at 71. The record he almost never made became the holy grail of a subculture that refused to let the music die. That is the perfect Northern Soul story. That is number 1.